From KUNC and the NPR network, this is In The NoCo. I'm Erin O'Toole. Dozens of childcare and preschool centers in Colorado are run by companies backed by private equity funding. Private equity firms use investor money to buy companies with a goal of improving them and then selling them for a profit. Private investment can help a small childcare business grow and make upgrades, which could be useful in a state like Colorado that has a childcare shortage. But many private equity firms have a reputation for cutting staff and raising prices. And that possibility has some Colorado lawmakers worried. Several legislators at the state capitol have introduced a bill that aims to establish some guardrails for centers owned by private equity. We wanted to understand the concerns that led to this bill. So we talked to journalist Ann Schimke, who reports on this issue for Chalkbeat Colorado. She found 170 childcare centers in Colorado run by chains that are owned by private equity firms.
The most recognizable ones are KinderCare, Primrose Schools, Goddard Schools, the Learning Experience.
So help us understand why some experts and state lawmakers are concerned about what could happen when a private equity firm takes over a childcare facility. You wrote about some issues at a place called the Nest School in Highlands Ranch. What happened there?
Sure. So last summer in mid-July, it had been a locally owned childcare center, and the Nest Schools, which is a national chain backed by private equity, purchased the center and very quickly started construction, both inside and outside the school while the kids were still attending. It soon became clear that they had not pulled building permits from the county building division. They had not submitted required plans to the health department.
Wow.
Parents complained to state childcare licensing officials, and there were concerns such as concrete chunks on the playground. At least one child found a box cutter.
Oh, wow.
Parents and teachers told us that the main security doors were propped open and workers would come and go during the school day. The school ended up shutting down just about 2.5 weeks after the ownership transferred, and the kids were sent to 2 other locations of the Nest Schools while they fixed some of the problems that had been identified.
It's so interesting to me, Anne, because the business of childcare doesn't exactly have a reputation for generous salaries or lavish profits. Why would private equity even want to get into the childcare business?
That's a great point, and you're absolutely right. Many of the childcare providers in Colorado and elsewhere, they're barely making it, and their profit margins may be 1% or less. But I think what private equity does well is find the corners of any industry where there is money to be made. So in Colorado, that's why we're seeing childcare centers backed by private equity chains along the Front Range in wealthier communities where parents may be able to shoulder tuition increases or fee hikes, which is one of the ways that private equity-backed chains make that profit.
We know that Colorado has a huge need for accessible, affordable preschool. Proponents of the private equity model say they can provide more capacity and better efficiency. So is it necessarily bad if a large investment firm owns childcare centers?
I think there's 2 points here to note. And one is, and many childcare chains backed by private equity will say this, we're already here. We're already providing much needed childcare seats in an environment where there's a severe shortage. So that's true. And I think private equity in general, they have deep pockets. They do have the money to make upgrades. But I think it's important to remember that private equity has a major profit motive. That is their goal. They also tend to buy these companies for 3 to 7 years and then sell them, sometimes to other private equity firms. So they don't necessarily have the long-term sustainability of a company in mind.
Right.
And I think that's what you'll hear from critics.
And I think you touched on a point that's very important to parents. You talk to a lot of people connected to preschools backed by private investment. Could you give us a sense of how they try to balance caring for young kids with delivering profits for investors?
Yeah, there's a couple of ways that private equity firms make money. One is by cutting costs. In any child care center, that's going to be staff. Also, raising prices is another way, which is, again, why we see these centers in wealthier communities. And one thing I should note, too, more states, including Colorado, are sending more public money into childcare. In Colorado's case, it's our universal preschool program, which is now in its second year. And so some lawmakers are worried that as more public money goes to childcare and as private equity-backed chains expand their footprint, it's in some ways sending public money to Wall Street.
And let's talk then about the bill at the State House. 3 Democratic lawmakers introduced legislation that would set up some regulations specifically for childcare centers owned by private equity firms or backed by private equity. What would this bill do?
Yeah, the bill was debated in the House Health and Human Services Committee. The main thing it would do at this point is provide families and staff members 60 days notice if there's going to be any layoffs at the child care center or any type of enrollment changes once that center has been acquired by a private equity or venture capital backed child care chain.
Okay, so a little bit of transparency around if tuition is going to go up or layoffs are going to happen. And I know you attended that committee hearing at the Capitol. What stood out to you as you listened to the testimony?
Yeah, so there was probably more people who spoke in opposition to the bill than in favor of the bill, though there was some of each. Several representatives from private equity-backed chains spoke, including some owners of Goddard and Primrose School franchises. And I would say the main point that they made is if you're going to add new regulations, you should apply it to everybody, not just private equity or venture capital-backed chains.
You heard testimony from a couple who runs a child care center that's owned by one of these larger franchises. What was the perspective of these local franchisees?
Yeah, what they said is, look, we're here every day in the center. We know these kids. We're not hands-off owners who are elsewhere. We're very invested in serving these families. And so I think they very much felt that they have as much skin in the game as any other child care center operator.
Ann Schimke is a reporter for Chalkbeat Colorado. She's covering a bill that would regulate child care centers backed by private equity. We'll post a link to her list of the 170 private equity-backed centers she identified in our show notes and at KUNC.org. That's it today for In The NoCo. I'm Erin O'Toole. Thanks so much for listening.